Welcome to Curium. As part of structure 2.2.6, you are expected to be able to deduce if a molecule is polar based on the presence of polar bonds and the symmetry of the molecule. Before we begin, there are some key concepts it would be helpful if you understood. A polar covalent bond and a non-polar covalent bond. We will recap these shortly. What is a dipole? What is VSEPR theory? And how do we use VSEPR theory to determine the molecular geometry? There are two types of covalent bonds, nonpolar bonds and polar bonds. Nonpolar bonds are formed between atoms which have no difference in electronegativity. For example, two fluorine atoms with the same electronegativity value have the same attraction for that shared pair of electrons. This means that on average, that electron pair is likely to be found approximately halfway between these two atoms. Note that there's an exception to this. The carbon-hydrogen bond, which does show a small difference in electronegativity, is still considered nonpolar by the IB. Polar bonds are different. They occur between atoms which have a difference in electronegativity that is less than 1.8. In a polar bond, the electron pair is found on average a little bit closer to whichever atom has the higher electronegativity value. This results in a slight positive and negative charge represented by those delta symbols. In a nonpolar molecule, you may have polar bonds present, but because of the overall symmetry of the molecule, these dipoles cancel out, and so the overall molecule is not polar. Take a molecule of CO2, for example. Polar bonds exist between the carbon and the oxygen, but oxygen is the more electronegative and so receives the delta negative on both sides of the molecule, with the delta positive of the carbon being stuck in the middle. So we can see that although there are polar bonds present, there is no clear positive and negative end to the molecule with a charge or a partial charge, and so this molecule is considered not polar. In a nonpolar, ammonia is another example of a polar molecule. Because there are polar bonds present between the nitrogen and the hydrogen, each bond has a partial positive on each of the hydrogens and a partial negative on the nitrogen. Remember that the nitrogen also has a lone pair. That lone pair causes repulsion between it and the bonding pairs of electrons which join it to the hydrogen. That forces those hydrogens down a little bit, which makes the molecule asymmetrical or unsymmetrical. This results in a positive end of the molecule and a negative end of the molecule. Note that the negative end is not caused by the presence of the lone pair of electrons, it is caused by the partial negative from the polar bond. Let's look at another example of a nonpolar molecule, boron tetrafluoride. A reminder that boron is an exception to the octet rule, which is stable with only 6 electrons in its outer shell. Polar bonds exist between the boron and the fluorines, meaning that each of those fluorines is partially negative, with the partial positive being concentrated in the middle on the boron. So although there are polar bonds present, there isn't a clear end to this molecule which would be partially positive and a clear end which would be partially negative. It can be considered that the entire outside of the molecule is considered partially negative. Hence, it is a nonpolar molecule. Let's look at one last molecule of chloromethane as our example of a polar molecule. We identified at the start that the bond between a carbon and a hydrogen is considered nonpolar, so we can almost ignore the entire bottom half of this molecule. A polar bond does exist between the carbon and the chlorine, so this will be the focus. Since we're ignoring the bottom half, we can consider that one end of the molecule is partially negative and one end of the molecule is partially positive. So because of the symmetry of the molecule, the dipoles don't cancel out, and overall it's considered polar. An example of a tetrahedral non-polar molecule occurs in methane itself and also in tetrachloromethane. In methane itself, we can see that there are no polar bonds present, and it's not possible to be a polar molecule unless you have polar bonds. Hence, methane is considered non-polar. Chloromethane is also considered nonpolar because although there are polar bonds present, the partial negative is concentrated on the outside because of the placement of the chlorines, and the partial positive is concentrated on the inside. This means that because of the symmetry of the molecule, the dipoles cancel out, and overall, this is also a nonpolar molecule. So in summary, when you are determining if a molecule is polar, you should check two things. One, if it has polar bonds. Without polar bonds, a molecule cannot be polar. The second thing, if the shape or the molecular geometry of the molecule causes the dipoles to cancel out. A tip for paper 2 questions. It's very important to note the word symmetry or to mention it in your answer. So for example, you might say the symmetry of the molecule causes the dipoles to cancel, or the molecule is asymmetrical or unsymmetrical, so the dipoles don't cancel. And use that to justify why you identify a molecule is either polar or nonpolar. Now let's go through a couple of examples of past IB questions. One example of a difficulty level medium is shown. The reason this is considered medium is because it is expected that you would recognise both A and B as exceptions to the octet rule. They can hold 4 and 6 electrons in their outer shell and are stable without the typically required 8. Now for a question like this, you should draw the Lewis diagram for each of the molecules, and when you do, you simply determine if the dipoles cancel out, and you end up with a positive end and a negative end. This is not possible in A. The partial negative is on both ends. This is also not possible for B. The negative is on all of the outside of the molecule. Similar to D, all of the outside is considered negative. Let's look at NCl. It has a lone pair, and that lone pair is able to exert a repulsive force on those shared pair of electrons. That pushes those 2 chlorine atoms down, and so overall you end up with a partial negative end of the chlorines and a partial positive end of the nitrogen. An example of a difficulty level medium, paper 2. Predict and explain whether the molecules NH3 and BF3 are polar molecules. Again, the fact that BF3 is stable with an incomplete octet is what makes this slightly more difficult. Similar to the last question, you draw the Lewis diagram of each of them and then identify if the dipoles will cancel out or if you end up with a partial positive and partial negative end to the molecule. Similar to the last one, the fluorines will all be negative, which means that the entire outside of the molecule is considered a negative end and there is no positive end. Compare this to the NH3. Similar to the last one, the lone pair causes a repulsive force on those shared pair of electrons, and so you end up with a partial positive end here and a partial negative end here. The key terminology that you want to mention is that the boron and fluorine bond polarities, they cancel each other out, or that there's a symmetrical distribution of charge. So overall, the molecule is not polar. Compare this to NH3. The molecule is considered polar because the bond polarities do not cancel each other out, and you end up with an unsymmetrical distribution of charge. A reminder that when you have a comparison question, for example, you have to compare 2 molecules, make sure that you mention both molecules in your answer. Also, the paper 2s to this date have typically accepted a suitable diagram if you show the net dipole moment. That means that you must show the dipole moment of the entire molecule. The blue arrow, that vector, shows the dipole moment of this molecule. Now let's look at an example of a difficult paper 1. You're asked which structure is shown with the correct bond and molecular dipoles. First thing we can do is rule out both A and B because neither of them shows the molecular dipoles which is required in the question. Both C and D do. Within C and D, I first want to check do they have the correct bond dipoles. Because carbon has a lower electronegativity than either chlorine or fluorine in both molecules, carbon should have the partial positive and the chlorines and fluorines should have the partial negatives. This is shown correctly in both of them. Now it's dependent on the molecular dipoles. The molecular dipoles are highlighted for you in pink in each of the molecules. Although both of these molecules are symmetrical overall, their dipoles aren't. Fluorine is more electronegative than chlorine. So your overall molecular dipole shifts in order to reflect that, so that the fluorine end of the molecule becomes partially negative and the chlorine end of the molecule becomes more partially positive. This is correctly seen in answer D. Now let's look at a medium difficult paper 2. The first part of this question would require you to draw this molecule, and in this part you have to predict with an explanation what its polarity would be. The tricky part in this comes from the fact that the molecule is a little bit more complicated than the ones you're used to seeing. However, its basic structure is not that dissimilar to other molecules which we've seen. If nitrogen was joined to hydrogens and had the lone pairs, as we saw with ammonia earlier, we would have no problem identifying the polarity of this. This tridinitroamide molecule is exactly the same as the ammonia, except the nitrides replace the hydrogens. Similar to ammonia, the lone pair of electrons causes repulsion to the bonding pairs, which means that overall, this end of the molecule becomes partially positive, and this end of the molecule becomes partially negative. So overall, there is a net dipole present because there's an unsymmetrical distribution of charge because your polar bonds don't cancel out. Similar to the last one, if you show this as a diagram with a net dipole moment, that answer will also be accepted.